My research was in the drug dependence field. In particular, we looked at patients with amphetamine dependence. So I evaluated a combination of pharmacological therapy and psychotherapy in this patient population. And what we found is that treatment with this combination led to a reduction in drug consumption and frequency of drug use. I continue to work in the addiction medicine field, so I continue doing research in amphetamine dependent population. However, what I'm adding to my postdoc period is that I'm using brain imaging techniques such as PET imaging and functional imaging to both understand what happens in the diseased brain of a drug dependent person, but also how treatment affects this diseased brain. I'm a clinical psychologist by training. I received my first license from India, where I worked there for several years, and then I went on to the United States to focus more in clinical psychology and addiction medicine, and there I got another license as a psychologist from there. Research to me actually happened by pure coincidence. I met a wonderful man in Chicago, Jonas. I came to visit him in Sweden, and then by chance I met a then professor at Karolinska, Professor Yasmin Hurd. And I explained to her my background and what I'm going to do, and it took her a matter of minutes to convince me that I should continue in Karolinska, stay here, and combine my clinical knowledge with addiction research here. And so you can say it was a right person at the right time. I think if I have to put the story in short, it was a happy ending. Jonas and I are still together. We are happily married. We have a beautiful little boy, Hjalmar, and we continue living in Sweden. In my research, I did human laboratory studies where we use both healthy controls and patients. And a typical day would be work from maybe 7 in the morning to 8 in the night. And we did a series of testings. They could be psychological testing, like questionnaires, but also biological testing like blood pressure, pulse, and biological samples. But the most challenging part was when we actually worked with the patients, because this was an amphetamine dependent population. They had very heavy neurological damages. So we couldn't even leave them alone for 5 minutes because they would just run off from the lab. And we had to maintain a neutral environment, so that they're not too aroused or too depressed. So it was a bit of a creative research, if I can say so, both entertaining but also thinking of the science behind it. I had two supervisors during my PhD time, Professor Johan Frank and Professor Yasmin Hurd. And they both had very different skills in supervision. One was a very hands-off and one was extremely hands-on supervisor. But they both had one ideology, that basically students write their papers by themselves. So from the start, it was like throwing in the deep end and you learn to swim. So I can say I basically wrote all the papers myself. But in hindsight, I think you learn the science best is when you write. So I'm very grateful for that kind of supervision. For me, the most fun part when I started off my PhD studies was basically I was all by myself in the laboratory. It was just my boss and myself. Coming from a big country and a big family and always having the need to talk so much, I was suddenly in this environment where I basically just had to be by myself for endless hours. That I think was more fun and very challenging. But over time, our group has grown exponentially, and I would say that has been the most fun part for me, that we have this interaction between preclinical and clinical research in addiction medicine. I think it's a great interface to have both clinical practice and clinical research going hand in hand. And I can give you one example of that. In my PhD studies, I was looking at developing a model that understands what really happens in the brain when someone sees drugs or uses drugs. And then we had a patient who was undergoing this testing, and suddenly he became really agitated and aggressive. And then he said, when we interviewed him, that he could actually smell phenyl, a detergent which is outside. And that smell reminded him of a place for example, in T. centralen, where he actually used the drugs. So then you get to understand that there's both a conscious level where a person knows he wants to take a drug, but also the subconscious and more complex level. And now we're designing studies based on this patient's experience on looking at what happens in the brain, both on the conscious level and the subconscious level. And hopefully we have medication that targets both these systems. 5 years from now, I think I'm definitely still going to be doing research in addiction medicine, hopefully still at Karolinska Institutet. That's it.